Okay, well, it is 7 p.m., so we'll go ahead and get started for the evening. Welcome back to our third week of PPA 670. Hope everyone is doing well and you've had a good week up to this point in time. Let me just, before we get into our information for this evening, let me double check and make sure that everything, yep, we are recording. We've got about 11 folks here, so we'll have some more showing up along the way. But let me just first start out with just some housekeeping items in terms of course assignments, just as reminders for you. Again, your major reminder for this evening is if you have not yet turned in your background problem statement and stakeholders paper, that is due by 11:59 p.m. tonight. So please make sure to get that turned in. I know several have already come in. I've had a chance to take a look at a few of those that came in early and returned them with some comments, and so far so good. No major issues with any of them. So if you haven't done it yet, make sure to get that turned in. And then also be sure to finish up your beach board posting number 2 and your 2 responses to classmates, looking at different theoretical approaches and their applicability to your societal problem. That should all be wrapped up by this evening as well. Now, as we already mentioned before, next week is Veterans Day on the 11th, so obviously we will not be having class next week, but we will be back together then in 2 weeks on the 18th. When we get back together on the 18th, then you again have 2 assignments due on the 18th. You have your literature review, annotated bibliography alternatives development paper due, and then you also have beach board number 3. Again, you've got overlap between those 2 assignments, and so once you do your literature review, annotated bib, and alternatives development paper, you'll have what you need then to copy and paste into beach board number 3 for that assignment. But just as a reminder, for this next upcoming paper in 2 weeks, what you'll be providing to me is you'll be giving me a title page. You'll then give me a brief summary of your societal problem, basically just to remind me what your problem is that you're working on. And then the main heart of the paper will be giving me some possible solutions, some possible alternatives that could form the basis of a policy to address the problem that you've identified. So what I'm looking at here is maybe 2 or 3 different alternatives that could form the basis for policy. Tell me what those alternatives are. Give me a little bit of information on those alternatives, what those alternatives entail, who would be involved in those alternatives, and just kind of flesh those alternatives out for me a little bit. Again, just 2 or 3 certainly would be sufficient. And then after that, you'll then provide me with your annotations for 6 different sources. So that's what the paper is going to look like that's due in 2 weeks. I've also provided for you an example of annotations up on our beach board site. I've been asked to provide that. And so I just gave you a couple of different examples of what annotations look like. Again, for that part of the paper, you'll be giving me the citation, and then you'll be giving me maybe a paragraph or so, description, synopsis of that article. Then you'll give me the next citation, then a synopsis for the second article, and so on, for a grand total of 6 articles. Now, typically, most of those will come from peer-reviewed journals. You certainly can use government sources, federal government websites, if you find them to be credible in terms of the information they're providing. But you'll need to have 6 of those sources as part of this second paper assignment. So again, title page, brief description of your societal problem, 2 or 3 alternatives, what they entail, who may be involved in those alternatives, and then your 6 annotations. And that is then due in 2 weeks, 11:59 p.m. on November the 18th. Then for your beach board number 3, what you're doing is just selecting one of those solutions or alternatives just to share with the rest of the class. So you literally can just copy and paste one of your alternatives, put it into beach board number 3, and then provide responses to 2 of your classmates. So kind of let you double dip a little bit for those 2 assignments that are due on November 18th. Any questions about these upcoming assignments?
Hi, Professor. I had a question about the literature review.
Okay.
So you're saying the brief summary of the problem and the alternatives to address the problem. So is there any like page or length that you're looking for with that first part?
Yeah, it's a good question, but there really isn't. I think a lot of it's going to depend upon the alternatives that you're generating. Some alternatives could be, pretty in depth and might take you a little bit of time to describe them. Some may be very much straightforward and won't take you quite as long. I would think if you're giving me 2 to 3 alternatives, I'm sure you can describe each of those alternatives within a page, I would think would certainly be sufficient. Your description of your societal problem, you can keep that very short because all you're doing is just reminding me of what the societal problem is.
And then should that part of the assignment be like fully referenced using the 6 references, or do we not need to reference that because we have the references later?
Yeah, you don't have to include a reference page in this one because you've got your citations there in the annotation part of the paper. So you don't need a reference page for this one. You also, as you're talking about your alternatives, I'm assuming that you're generating those alternatives informed by some of the research that you have done. So you'll still do your in-text citations for your description of your alternatives. You'll still have those APA formatted in-text citations for any information that you use in the description of those alternatives.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Again, I know it's 2 weeks out and you're just finishing up the background paper, so you may not have given a lot of thought to this, and that's understandable. But if you have given some thought to it, any further questions on this second writing assignment?
Yes, I had a question if you were going to post a sample of the literature review.
Yeah, I did post a couple of annotations. So I have examples of what annotations look like. I posted those up on the Beach Force site.
Thank you.
Sure. I'm sure over the next 2 weeks, as you're working on this, you'll have questions. Feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. It is kind of awkward not having class next week, but I'll certainly be available at the ready at my email for any questions you have over the next couple of weeks. So
I actually had another question. So for the second part of the assignment that's due tonight, I have laws, like California laws. Do you have any examples on how to cite those and put it as a reference?
APA, if you go to Purdue University OWL, it's called OWL at Purdue University, they have really nice examples of how you cite government documents, how you cite government websites, how you cite all that information, how you cite legal opinions, how you cite legislation. So you should be able to find some good examples on that. It's Purdue University and it's called OWL, O-W-L.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you should just be able to Google it. If you just Google Purdue OWL APA examples, it should pop right up for you. Okay, what I have on the agenda for this evening is I really want to kind of narrow our focus tonight. And I really want to narrow our focus tonight on the idea of alternatives, alternative development, and then the assessment of alternatives, because that's something you're going to be working on for the paper that is due in 2 weeks. So rather than forging ahead and getting into specific policy areas, I really just want us to focus on this idea of the development and the assessment of alternatives that can then form the basis for a policy solution to your societal problem. So let me go ahead and start up the slides here. I'm not going to go through each slide in painstaking detail, but again, what I really want to take away from our discussion tonight is, how do we put these alternatives together and how do we compare them to each other to evaluate them to determine which alternative or alternatives plural should serve as the basis for our policy approach. Now, again, it's a little bit more of an art than a science sometimes when you are developing and then assessing alternatives. But this alternative development and assessment is going to occur in our policy formulation phase. So at this point of the policy process, the problem has been somewhat identified, and it has made its way onto the formal agenda of a decision-making body. So we've gone through problem definition and agenda setting, and now we're squarely within this policy formulation phase where we're trying to come up with solutions and answers to the societal problem that we need to address. So as we develop our alternative proposals, ways to address our societal problem, we are going to need to compare various alternatives based upon a set of criteria. So we're going to start out tonight talking about some of the evaluative criteria that we use for comparing these different alternatives to each other, these different policy proposals. Then we're going to talk about some of the tools that are available at our disposal for doing this type of evaluation, this type of analysis. And then when we complete our discussion tonight, we'll take a break. And then after the break, I would like for us to do some breakout groups where we can actually apply some of this information to the generation of alternatives. So you can actually have some practice generating these alternatives before you need to do it for your societal problem in the paper in 2 weeks. So we need to compare these different alternative solutions to our problem. And so we've got all these different criteria that we can use. And these evaluative criteria, unfortunately, oftentimes run counter to each other and they conflict with each other. So things such as effectiveness, achieving our program, our policy outcomes, efficiency, the ability to achieve more outcomes and better outcomes with fewer inputs. Risk, the amount of risk that is involved in trying to solve this societal problem. Uncertainty, the amount of uncertainty we have about whether or not this alternative will actually sufficiently address and solve the societal problem that we want to try and address and solve. Ethical implications in terms of how we are treating people. Political feasibility. Do we have decision makers in place who are willing to support this policy proposal? Administrative feasibility. So not only is it politically feasible, but is it administratively feasible? Meaning, can it be implemented? How easy or how difficult is it to implement this proposal? Because the best formulated policies that are designed very, very well may fall apart at the implementation stage. And we'll talk later on tonight about implementation, and we'll talk about Pressman, Waldowski, and some examples of when implementation doesn't work and why implementation doesn't work. Personal liberty and freedom. Sometimes the policy proposals that we generate will require certain types of behavior on the part of citizens, or will prohibit citizens from engaging in certain types of behaviors. And whenever you try and shape and mold individual behavior, you're going to have some questions about personal liberty and personal freedom. So we've got a lot of different criteria out there that we can use to try and assess and compare these proposals to each other. So just to run through them relatively quickly, I think a lot of this is probably intuitive and commonsensical, but the first and probably primary criteria is effectiveness. Any proposal that we put out there, any alternative solution that we offer up, should be effective at solving the problem. It should be able to achieve our goals and our objectives with formulating this policy to begin with. So effectiveness is our ability to reach our policy goal and policy objective. The problem with that is that, again, as I said, sometimes in trying to achieve our policy goals, we have to shape human behavior. And when we shape human behavior, we run square up against personal liberty and personal freedom. And that's just an example of how a lot of these criteria tend to compete with each other. So effectiveness can compete with personal liberty. Effectiveness can also compete with efficiency. You can be effective and not be terribly efficient. You can be efficient and not be terribly effective. Now, you could be achieving your goals, but you're consuming a massive amount of resources in order to achieve those goals. And there could be a more efficient way of using those resources to achieve that goal. Now, likewise, you may be very efficient in that you're creating a large amount of output with very few inputs, but those outputs are not achieving the outcomes, the consequences that we want to achieve with the policy. And last week, we talked about the differences between outputs versus outcomes. Outputs is what the policy is creating in terms of tangible services and goods. The outcomes are the consequences of consuming those services and those goods. So our long-term consequences or outcomes are oftentimes what we are very, very interested in. In addition to effectiveness, obviously, as we said, we have efficiency. And when we say efficiency is trying to achieve more with fewer inputs. But whenever we have a public policy, usually in this country, we kind of defer to the private market. We like to talk about the invisible hand of capitalism, the invisible hand of the market. The invisible hand of the market will guide us in terms of supply and demand types of decisions, and will guide us in terms of consumption and pricing types of decisions. But whenever we have a public policy, by definition, we are usually talking about some aspect of government intervention. And when government intervenes, it means that we are oftentimes choosing to displace private resources with public resources. So something that otherwise would have been left to the private sector, we're saying, no, we want government to do this and to do it with government resources. So those government resources with public policies will usually displace private sector resources. So what that means with efficiency is that the value we are getting from those public resources need to exceed the value we would have gotten with those private resources. That government intervention needs to be justified in that it's a good thing, it's an efficient thing to have use of government resources as opposed to use of private sector resources. And so it really gets to the very heart of this idea of whether or not we should have government intervention, and if we should have government intervention, how much government intervention should there be? This is always something that government takes a hit on, is this idea of efficiency. Usually when we are privatizing things, we usually justify privatization by saying, well, it's more efficient to leave it to the private sector, because the private sector can do it more efficiently because there's more competition in the private sector. When government takes over, it's going to be a monopoly, and so therefore the absence of competition means that there's less efficiency. The source of funding that governments have will be much different than the sources of funding that the private sector has. The government organizations, they are going to get their funding from obviously a lot of appropriations. Private sector organizations get their funding from selling goods and making a profit. So in the public sector, our revenue streams tend to be much more stable than the revenue streams for a private sector corporation. When you have very stable revenue streams and you can count on appropriations year in and year out, there's less of an incentive to be efficient. Because if you're not efficient, you're still going to get your appropriations next year. If you're a private corporation and you're not efficient, you're probably going to go out of business. And so again, just those sources of revenue can have an impact upon public versus private efficiency. But when we're comparing our policy proposals and our alternatives, if we're saying this is something government should do, hopefully there's an aspect of efficiency involved, that we can show that yes, government is capable of being efficient in providing and producing these goods and these services. So efficiency is another evaluative criteria. Equity is another very important evaluative criteria. And as you probably already know, there are two aspects of equity. There's process equity and there's outcomes equity. Process equity talks about fairness in the decision-making process. So fairness in the process of formulating and implementing this policy. So how the policy is being put together, who is participating, how that policy is being implemented. If we have fairness in those processes, then we have what we call process equity. Clearly, outcomes equity is going to look at the outcomes of the policy and the equitable distribution of these goods and services that are being produced by this policy approach. Like John Rawls says, it's a fair distribution of societal goods when we're looking at outcome equity. Equity is an extremely important concept for any redistributive policy. And we had said in a previous class that of Lowy's typology of different policies is distributive, redistributive, and regulatory typology. The vast majority of our policies tend to be either redistributive or regulatory. So for a lot of our policies, equity is a very important consideration. Whenever you're redistributing wealth from one segment of society to another segment of society, you need to be concerned about fairness. You need to be concerned about, can those who are being harmed by this policy then be compensated later on through the benefits of the policy? If so, then you'll have a measure of equity. Equity really cuts across the vast majority of societal problems that we deal with and the vast majority of policies we deal with. Just about any policy that has economic implications will have some equity component to it. But it's important to also recognize that equity is not the same thing as equality. So here, when we're talking about equity, we are talking about fairness. Equality deals with sameness. So equality says everyone gets the same thing. Equity says that it's fair because everyone gets what they need in order to be equal with everyone else. They get what they need. And some people may need more of something than other segments of our society. So like in this depiction, equality on the left-hand side, all of these three individuals all get one box to stand on. You can see for the person on the right side, that doesn't help them at all because they still can't see the baseball game. With equity, you see the person on the right-hand side gets two of the three boxes, which allows that person to then be able to see the baseball game. The person on the left-hand side doesn't need any of those boxes, and so therefore doesn't get them. And so that's kind of that difference between treating everyone in the same way and treating everyone in a fair manner. And so equity is very, very important as an evaluative criteria. Ethical values and political values are also important evaluative criteria in choosing between different policy proposals, different alternative solutions. So when we're looking at the conflict and the tension, if you will, between ethical values and political values, we are looking at things such as public authority, public interest, individual rights, justice, equality, as we mentioned before, efficiency, effectiveness. Those are all kind of basic concepts that we're going to need to consider in comparing our policies to each other, our policy approaches to each other. And again, there are a lot of trade-offs involved with these different evaluative criteria. What may make ethical sense may not make political sense. And certainly some things that make great political sense may not be terribly ethical. And so these two are usually at loggerheads with each other. So we've got all, and there are others, we've got all these evaluative criteria that we will use to compare our policy approaches to each other in order to determine which approach is the most effective approach to use as the basis of our public policy to solve our societal problem. Well, how do we do it? How do we incorporate these evaluative criteria together in order to make those types of decisions? Well, two of the more common approaches or methods that we use in policy analysis are cost-benefit analysis and cost-effectiveness analysis. If you have taken the budgeting class, you've probably already talked about cost-benefit analysis, but I'm not sure if you've talked about cost-effectiveness analysis yet. But there are some similarities and some good overlap between cost-benefit and cost-effectiveness analysis. One overlap between the two approaches is they're both economical approaches in that we are trying to value the costs of a certain course of action and comparing that then to the outcomes and the cost of the outcomes of that type of action. So there will be costs associated with the implementation of the policy. There will be costs associated with the outcomes being produced by that policy. There will be benefits that are produced as the outcome of that policy as well. And so we're trying to balance those costs and those benefits. They're basically decision-making models that really focus on the impacts of these different policy approaches. So one of the things that we do in both cost benefit as well as cost effectiveness analysis is we engage in forecasting, where we will look into the future to try and forecast what types of benefits and the value of the benefits that will accrue from a certain policy type of an approach. Let's look at cost-benefit analysis first, and then we'll turn the page and look at cost-effectiveness analysis. And I'll talk you through a couple of examples of cost-benefit versus cost-effectiveness analysis to, again, try and show you some of the similarities and some of the differences in these approaches to choosing between our different policy alternatives. So in cost-benefit analysis, cost-benefit analysis tends to be a relatively linear type of decision-making process. So in cost-benefit analysis, we will go through several steps. Our first step in cost-benefit analysis is to try and, as the name says, identify the costs and the benefits of engaging in a certain type of activity, in pursuing a certain type of policy. Identifying the costs and the benefits, it's not an easy endeavor. Oftentimes, the cost of creating a policy and implementing a policy will sometimes be easier to see and identify than some of the benefits. And the reason for that is some of the benefits of our policies don't occur all at once, and they don't occur right away. Some benefits of policies will occur a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So if you've got a benefit that's not going to occur for a decade in the future, it's going to be kind of hard for you at this point to be able to identify what that benefit is. But as human beings, we have these cognitive limitations, and we have our bounded rationality in which we work. So we do the best job we can to identify the range of costs and benefits associated with these different policy alternatives. In cost-benefit analysis, you then take those costs and those benefits and you monetize them, which just simply means you add dollar values to them. So how much are these costs and benefits worth in dollar values, in money value? Some things are very easy to monetize. Some things are much more difficult to monetize. And you'll see that with the example we'll go through in just a second. Since some of these benefits will not occur for quite some time in the future, we then also have to engage in a process known as discounting. So when a benefit is not going to occur for a year or 5 years in the future, the value of that benefit, the future value of that benefit, is not the same value that we would have if we got that benefit today. So the classic example from a budgeting or an economics class is, if I give you $1,000 on January 1st, or I promise to give you $1,000 on the following December 31st, those two dollar values are not the same. Why is $1,000 in hand on January 1st not the same value as $1,000 that you'll get on December 31st? Why the difference in values? You know, they're both $1,000, but why the different in values?
Would there be a change in the timing? Like, I guess I'm thinking of like inflation. That I know that things are going up and down right now. Would it be related to something like that?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. If I give you $1,000 on January 1st, think about what you can do with that $1,000 over the course of that calendar year. You could invest that $1,000. Now, if you invest that $1,000 and you get a 5% return rate, then at the end of the year, that $1,000 is going to be worth more than it was on January 1st, because you can invest that money at the prevailing interest rate. When you get that money on December 31st, the year is already over, and you've missed out on being able to invest and earn that additional interest. So we need to take the future value of benefits that are being created by a policy and discount those values back to present dollar values. So we have to go from what we call future value and discount it back to present value. That's the process known as discounting for time. So we have to go through this discounting type of process. We also have to discount the value of benefits based upon risk. So we have to take into account, what's the risk that this benefit will never accrue even if we implement this policy. So we're implementing this policy and we're hoping we're going to get this benefit from it. What if that never happens? And when I teach budgeting, the example I usually use is if we're choosing between a recreation center, building a recreation center, and building a senior center. Well, there'll be certain types of benefits that will accrue because of the recreation center and certain types of benefits that will accrue because of the senior center. For the recreation center, some of the benefits is, well, we may be able to generate additional revenue because we can charge people dues, membership fees to use the recreation center. We'll have a more productive workforce because people will ostensibly be using the recreation center and they'll be healthier and they'll be more productive and they'll miss less work. Maybe insurance costs will go down because people are healthier and so they look better in the amortization tables, and so therefore we'll be paying less in insurance costs. Now, those are all potential benefits. What if that doesn't happen? What if we build this recreation center? It's the old adage, if you build it, they will come. Or what if you build it, they don't come and people don't show up? So we don't get the additional revenue. So we don't get the productivity increases. So we don't get the lower insurance costs. There's some risk always involved with any policy. And we formulate the policy, we can do a really good job of saying A, B, and C will happen. And once this policy is implemented, A, B, and C sometimes do not always happen. So what's the probability that these benefits will actually occur? You need to take those probabilities into account as well in doing what we call discounting for risk. So a lot of moving parts in a cost-benefit analysis. But the ultimate goal of the cost-benefit analysis is to create this thing called a benefit-cost ratio, or a BCR. The benefit-cost ratio is a simple calculation of the net present value of the benefits associated with the policy divided by the net present value of the costs associated with the policy. Clearly, in a very simple division problem like this, if the benefits and costs are equal, then your resulting benefit cost ratio will be 1. If your benefits exceed your costs, then your benefit cost ratio will be larger than 1. If your costs exceed your benefits, then your benefit cost ratio will be less than 1 because your denominator is larger than your numerator. So the very basic level of using a cost benefit analysis, if our benefit cost ratio is at least 1 or above, then that policy is economically feasible. Now, whether it is ethically feasible, whether it's politically feasible, those are other discussions. But at least it is economically feasible because we're not going to necessarily be losing money on this policy, where our benefits of the policy are going to at least be equal to, if not greater than, the cost of implementing that policy. That's a general idea behind a cost-benefit analysis. Now, obviously, there are a lot of limitations associated with cost-benefit analysis. Once you try and monetize costs and benefits, not all costs and benefits are easily monetized. There are some things that just do not lend themselves to a ready-made dollar value. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But there are clearly some things that you just can't monetize. Some benefits are more qualitative than they are quantitative. There's also the question about opportunity costs and how do we capture opportunity costs in our cost-benefit analysis. What is an opportunity cost? For all of you economists out there, what do we mean by an opportunity cost? Anyone familiar with the term opportunity cost? If we're pursuing policy A and we're putting resources behind policy A, we have a finite amount of resources. So it's kind of what we call in game theory a zero-sum game. That if resources are going to policy A, it means those resources are no longer available to fund policy B. So the opportunity cost of funding policy A is we no longer have the resources to then fund policy B. That's called an opportunity cost. We're missing out on the opportunity of pursuing policy B. How we capture those opportunity costs and how we monetize them, it's a difficult type of endeavor in a cost-benefit analysis.
Professor, could you give an example of an opportunity cost? I'm still a little confused.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, you go back to the example of the recreation center and the senior center. So the recreation center is going to cost $50 million. The senior center is going to cost $40 million. And we have a pot of money of $60 million. If we got that $60 million, once we put $50 million toward the recreation center, we now no longer have enough money to pay for the senior center. So the opportunity cost is we missed out on the opportunity of funding that senior center because we used up the resources funding the recreation center. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like the opportunity you're missing out on, and how much value are you losing by missing out on that opportunity. When we're comparing policies, and we have finite resources, and so we can't fund certainly every policy we would like to. We can't even fund the majority of policies that we would like to. So by putting money toward one policy, we're missing out on being able to fund another policy. But again, that's a really difficult thing to put a dollar value on, and that's one of the limitations of cost-benefit analysis. It oftentimes doesn't do a great job of capturing those types of opportunity costs. Discount rates. I said the major part of cost-benefit analysis back here, we said, was discounting for time and risk. Well, when you discount, when you go from future value and discount it back to present value, you use a rate, you use a discount rate. And so in our example, if I give you $1,000 on January 1st, or I give you $1,000 on December 31st, our discount rate would be the interest rate, the percentage that you could make by investing that money. Interest rates vary, and discount rates will vary. And so if you used a 5% discount rate, you would get one result. If you used a 10% discount rate, you would get a wildly different result. And so sometimes when different organizations do cost-benefit analyses, they will use different interest rates, different discount rates in doing their calculations. An example of that for you is in the federal budget process. You have two different organizations that kind of do similar things, but they do them differently. There's what's called the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB. That is kind of the budget watchdog agency for the president. And then the counterbalance of that is what we call the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, which does a lot of that same work, but does that work for Congress. The OMB uses a different discount rate than the Congressional Budget Office uses. And they can be wildly different rates. In some years, you'll see the Office of Management and Budget using a discount rate of 7%, and the Congressional Budget Office using a discount rate of 2 or 3%. Well, that's going to give you much different results from what you get from OMB and what you get from CBO. So using different discount rates can give you different results. And it's kind of like, garbage in and garbage out type of an approach. One of the major failings of a cost-benefit analysis is the difficulty in estimating intangible human costs and benefits. So something like putting a value, a dollar value on a human life, the value of a human life. Now, if you are in the insurance business, you probably say, we do this all the time. We have amortization tables, and we will put a dollar value on a human life using our table and using different variables such as the age of the person, the type of work the person does, the educational level of the person, the income level of the person, the amount of dependents that that person is responsible for. All those things go into this algorithm, and we can then calculate different values of human life for different people. So the insurance agencies do this all the time. But it's still a very subjective type of process. And the example I'll show you in just a second, it really led to a lot of problems in that example, in that the range that they were putting on the value of a human life, the authors of that study, went from anywhere from a low of $60,000 to a high of $8 million. Well, if you use $60,000 for the value of a human life, you're going to get a much different result in your cost-benefit analysis than if you use an $8 million valuation. Valuations are contingent on other factors. And so sometimes the value of a benefit will be contingent upon the value of another benefit. That something has to happen first before this benefit will actually accrue. So again, there are a lot of moving parts in a cost-benefit analysis that really has introduced a lot of criticism for cost-benefit analysis as an approach. Let me walk you through an example that I like to use here in this policy class, and I use it on occasion in my budgeting course as well, to kind of show you how a cost-benefit analysis will work, and then some of these limitations and some of these inherent problems with the cost-benefit analysis. The example comes from a policy book that we don't use in this class, but it's a book by authors Weimer and Vining. Not that you need to know that, but Weimer and Vining, in this example of a cost-benefit analysis, look at a situation where a community, a jurisdiction, is going to levy a higher tax on alcoholic beverages. So the jurisdiction wants to raise additional revenue. So they decide one way to do it is through a sin tax on alcoholic beverages. Well, if you increase the tax on alcoholic beverages, by definition, that's going to have what we call a price effect, in that once the tax goes up, that gets rolled into the price of those alcoholic beverages, and it makes those alcoholic beverages more expensive. So there's always a price effect. The idea, though, of this jurisdiction is they could do two things at once. They could raise additional revenue through this higher tax, but at the same time, they could depress consumption by making it more expensive. And so maybe people will turn away from consuming alcohol, and you'll have less rates of alcoholism in the jurisdiction. So they're kind of trying to do two conflicting types of things at the same time. They're looking to try and achieve two conflicting goals. But in this example of increasing the tax on alcoholic beverages, Weimer and Vining say we have to look at both the costs as well as the benefits of this heightened tax. So they argue that before we know the true costs and benefits of a higher tax, we have to know a couple of different things. One thing we need to know is what is called the price elasticity of alcoholic beverages. And this is your economic term known as price elasticity. Price elasticity measures, as the price goes up, what happens to demand. Normally, you would think for a very price elastic good, that as the price of the good goes up, demand for that good is going to go down. That's what we call a price elastic good. A price inelastic good would be one in which, as the price goes up, demand stays the same or increases. So there's no negative impact to demand with an increase in price. People are still going to purchase and consume that type of a commodity. So I said we need to know the price elasticity of alcohol. The problem, though, is that there are different price elasticities for different types of alcohol for different types of audiences. So they broke it down to hard liquor, wine, and beer as their three types of alcoholic beverages. And they argued that there are different price elasticities for hard liquor, wine, and beer. And those different elasticities will differ depending upon the consumer. So they said, if we're looking at older Americans, older folks tend to have less of a price elasticity for hard liquor, but more of a price elasticity for beer. That as the price of hard liquor goes up, older adults are going to continue to buy that hard liquor. So there's not a whole lot of price elasticity there. But as the price of beer goes up, older people are less likely to purchase that beer. So there's a lot of price elasticity for beer with older individuals. It's the complete opposite for younger individuals. Younger individuals tend to have very little price elasticity for beer and very high amounts of price elasticity for hard liquor. So we need to know what type of alcoholic beverage we're dealing with, and we also need to know what target audience we're dealing with as well. So again, really complicating the entire process. You need to know all that before you can calculate your costs and your benefits. Let's make it even more complicated. Let's say, what are some of the benefits if consumption of alcohol is reduced because of this increase in the taxation? what are some of the benefits that will accrue? Well, if people are drinking less, there could be fewer drunk driving accidents. I said, okay, let's start there and let's, kind of deconstruct that idea. So if there's less consumption, then there'll be fewer drunk driving accidents. Well, not all drunk driving accidents are the same. Some drunk driving accidents will result in property damage. Some will result in bodily harm. Some will result in fatalities. And so we have to treat those categories differently, because obviously the magnitude of the risk with a fatality in a drunk driving incident is so much higher than one that just results in property damage. So we've got to come up with those three different categories and treat those three differently. But to make it even more complicated, we also have to look at the amount of information the person has who is involved in that drunk driving accident. Ostensibly, the drunk driver, knows that they're inebriated. And so they are perfectly informed about how much they drank, and they know that they are driving drunk. So they're perfectly informed about that. However, the victim, who just happens to be driving the opposite way on that road and gets hit by this drunk driver, that victim doesn't know. That victim has no idea that the person coming toward them has been drinking. And so they are 0% informed about this drunk driving accident about to occur. So you got to take into account how much information the person has. And I could go on all night, because this was actually an entire chapter in their book where they just go through all these different elements that you need to think of in a cost-benefit analysis. But what does it mean for us? What it means for us is that a cost-benefit analysis is a good supplemental tool that we can use in choosing between different policy approaches. But it never should be the only tool that we are using, because a quantitative cost-benefit analysis is not capable of putting a dollar value on everything, the value of a human life. It's difficult to do that. And so we have to use it as a supplemental tool rather than using it as the sole tool. And if you'll forgive my language for a minute, I'm just going to give you an example of one article, very famous article that was written on cost-benefit analysis many years ago by Carl Williams. And Williams titled his article, Cost-Benefit Analysis, Bastard Science, or Insidious Poison in the Body Politique. A great title for something, article on something as dry as cost-benefit analysis. But Williams' point in the article was just that, is that cost-benefit analysis is a good supplemental tool, but it never should be used as the only tool that we use in policy analysis. The other tool that we oftentimes use more frequently in policy analysis is what's called cost-effectiveness analysis. And again, it sounds a lot like cost-benefit analysis, but there are some major differences. In a cost-effectiveness analysis, the question you're trying to answer is, how much does it cost to get to a certain outcome? So assume you have a situation where you've got some type of a health policy that is meant to reduce and eliminate some type of a disease. So an STI type of program that is meant to try and reduce and eliminate STIs and deaths from STIs. Well, how much are you willing to pay in terms of testing and treatment on this program to get at your outcome, which will be maybe 1,000 fewer deaths per year from this type of infection, or 500 fewer deaths per year because of this infection? So you look at how much will it cost you with this policy to get the outcome that you are trying to achieve. So how much will the policy cost to get you to your desired outcome? That's what we call a cost-effectiveness analysis. The nice thing about a cost-effectiveness analysis is we don't necessarily have to try and monetize intangible items. So we're not really putting a dollar value on a human life, but we're talking more about, how much do we save from having fewer instances of this disease that we have to test for and to treat. So cost-effectiveness analysis is much more common in policy analysis, and cost-benefit analysis tends to be a little bit more common in the world of public budgeting. So in a cost effectiveness analysis, what we will do is we will estimate the cost of formulating and implementing this policy. And then we will look at what this policy will result in. What types of outcomes will this policy result in? And what's the probability that these outcomes will accrue? And what are the costs associated with these outcomes? So the costs we are reducing by getting this outcome, are those costs worth the cost of pursuing this policy approach? So again, is it worth doing this health policy? Because that health policy gives us a scenario of avoiding deaths. And then you get into the question of, how many deaths are we willing to live with? No pun intended. How many deaths are we willing to be okay having based upon the cost of this policy? And I know it sounds morbid, and I know it sounds very cold and callous, but those are some of the things we think about in doing this type of a cost effectiveness analysis. In cost effectiveness analysis, there's obviously going to be risk that we are trying to mitigate. So there are risks in this world. And so with our policy, we're trying to mitigate some of those risks. We're trying to determine how much risk will occur in this situation and how well can this policy mitigate or reduce those types of risks. So again, with our health policy example, the risk of death or the risk of severe hospitalization, how much can this policy reduce the number of hospitalizations and the number of deaths that will occur from this type of a disease? Risk is around us all the time, and we have a lot of regulatory policies in place that are meant to try and reduce risk. We try and reduce risk in the workplace, and so OSHA has a lot of policies in place that will try and reduce the risk of worker injury. Now, there are costs associated with those OSHA policies. You're going to take away someone's personal freedom. You're going to tell them you can't use that chair, you can't use this desk, you have to use this chair or this desk. You have to wear this safety belt whenever you are lifting over a certain number of pounds. Those are all policies in place to protect workers, but in doing so, workers are giving up some of their personal liberty and some of their personal freedom in order to abide by those policies. We have regulatory policies in terms of food safety. And so these food safety policies and food safety regulations are again meant to try and reduce the number of illnesses and deaths associated with food impurities. Well, you're going to give up some of your personal liberty and some of your freedom in terms of you may not be able to consume a certain type of food item in a certain jurisdiction because of these types of regulations and these types of policies. The balancing act we have to do, obviously, is to look at the cost of the policy, not only in terms of dollars, but also in terms of the cost to personal freedom and personal liberty, opportunity costs. We have to look at the cost of the policy in comparison to the amount of risk that we are reducing. And one way we can do that is through this thing called the product of the probability. And we do this a lot in risk assessment in policy analysis. So with the product of probability, we look at the probability of an event occurring multiplied times the consequences that will happen if that event does occur. And I'm not going to get into vaccinations much. I know that's a very hot button topic, but it plays out well here in that with the product of probability, you would ask the question, what is the probability that someone who contracts COVID-19 is going to die from it or to have a serious hospitalization event because of it? So what's the probability that that's going to happen multiplied times the consequences of that event occurring? Now, obviously, the consequences of a death from COVID-19 are very profound consequences. The consequences of a severe hospitalization are very profound consequences. The consequences associated with having mild symptoms obviously will not be nearly as profound. So you take the probability that the event is going to occur, the outcome is going to occur, multiplied times the consequences, the importance of that outcome or that event occurring. So another way you can think about that's probably a less controversial way is to think about food safety and the U.S. food supply. So you think about the U.S. food supply, we know that there are risks associated with consuming food. Studies have shown us that about 1 in 6 Americans per year will get sick from food that they consume. That's 17%. That's a pretty high percentage of Americans who are going to get sick annually from consuming food. But of those, only 3,000 will die. So you actually put hard numbers on this. If you assume we have 350 million or so people in the US, maybe more than that now. We'll just say 350 million people. And if 1 in 6 Americans are getting sick, you're looking at about, 59 million or so Americans per year who will get some level of illness from consuming food. But of that 59 million, only 3,000 of those will die. So for your probability assessment here, the probability of it occurring is relatively high at 17%, but the magnitude of those consequences are relatively low. Now, obviously, they're high for those 3,000 people, but on a macro level, 3,000 out of 59 million is a relatively low number. So we do those types of risk evaluations when we are comparing our different policy approaches to hopefully find those policies that can mitigate those risks at the lowest cost possible so that we can have more resources than available to go out there and fund other policy approaches. So risk assessment is something we do frequently when we are comparing and assessing alternatives with each other. How well does this policy reduce the risk that we are trying to reduce? And what's the probability the risk will still occur? What's the magnitude if that risk does still occur? We don't know 100%. We will never know 100% what the benefits are and what the events may occur because of a policy that we are implementing. We don't know that for sure. We engage in forecasting and scenario writing in order to try and get a sense of what will happen as an outcome of implementing this policy, but we never really know for sure. We do forecasting all the time in policy analysis. When we are talking about Social Security policy and making a change to Social Security or Medicare, we do forecasting. We forecast how long will the Social Security program remain solvent. Will remain solvent through 2030, through 2025, through 2050. Different groups come up with different estimates, but we forecast how long we have in Social Security. Then we say, well, if we make this policy change, so say we increase the retirement age up to 70 years old. Well, let's forecast what does that mean for the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund. Does that buy us another 20 years? Does it buy us another 50 years? That's what we call forecasting. We forecast population changes all the time here in the US. Every 10 years, we do an actual enumeration of the population. On the years in between that, we forecast population changes in migration patterns. We also need to try and quantify the impacts of policies. And so if we pursue a certain policy, what are some of the impacts that it may have on things such as the environment? We do a lot of these impact assessments, especially in terms of environmental policy. The purpose of an impact assessment is to systematically examine the effects that occur from certain types of policy actions. So we'll do an impact assessment in policy of drilling in ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So if we increase oil and gas drilling in ANWR, we'll have to do an impact analysis, an impact assessment to see what is the impact of this increased oil and gas drilling on the environment in this protected wildlife refuge. The national level, we also have the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the National Environmental Policy Act requires these types of environmental impact analyses that must be done for certain projects and certain changes in policy. Here in the state of California, if you have ever dealt with a public construction project, a capital improvement project, you have probably become very familiar with what's called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, from back in the 1970s. CEQA requires environmental impact analyses must be done on certain types of public projects. So there is a possibility you can get a waiver from that, but if you have to get a CEQA environmental impact analysis, it's a lengthy process and it's a very expensive process. Sometimes you can get a waiver. And so I served on a school board for the past 6 years, and we had all kinds of capital projects going on. We had passed almost $150 million capital project, what we call a Prop 39 bond, to fund all these capital projects, modifications to schools and safety modifications and all those needed things that our 15 schools needed. In doing all these projects, we had to consider whether or not we had to do this environmental impact analysis or if we could get a waiver. And for us in the school district, we were able to apply for and get a waiver from CEQA if we were not expanding the square footage that already existed. So if we were going to say, for example, we had 10 portable classrooms. So we're going to take the money to take down those classrooms and replace them with a permanent building. Question would be, does the square footage of that permanent building fit within the footprint of the square footage of those portable units? If it did, and you weren't enhancing your square footage, then you could apply for and receive a waiver from CEQA where you would not have to do an environmental impact analysis. Now, to get that waiver, you have to hire consultants to do that waiver for you. And those consultants will charge you thousands of dollars to put together your waiver application. So even to get a waiver from CEQA, it's still going to be costly to most governments. But it's an important element of the law here in California to make sure we are doing these impact assessments for new projects and changes in policy that could have an impact upon the environment. So these environmental impact analyses are a very common strategy used in policy analysis. So it does go into factor into some of your thinking about this policy. Will this policy require an impact analysis from the state of California? Because if it does, even doing that may cost you $200,000, $300,000 depending upon the size of the project. Even if you get a waiver, it may still cost you $20,000 to $30,000 to get that waiver. In addition to doing impact analyses, impact assessments in terms of environmental impacts, we also have to do political feasibility analysis as well. We know that policy formulation occurs in an inherently political environment. Since we are operating in this inherently political environment, political imperatives oftentimes trump economic imperatives. So if something makes economic sense, that is great. If the cost benefit and the cost effectiveness analysis look good, that's great. But if you don't have the political actors who are supporting this policy, it's probably not going to make it through the political system. So we do these political feasibility analyses all the time to look at the stakeholders who are involved in this policy formulation and policy legitimation process. Then organizations like the NRA and the AARP and the AMA and the ABA and all these other influential organizations, depending upon the policy area, to see who is affected by the policy, how strongly do they feel about the policy, and how does the policy affect them. One approach that was used years ago, and it's not used quite as much now, but I think it's a nice teaching tool for us tonight, is an approach of political feasibility analysis known as the Prince system. And it's called the Prince system of political feasibility analysis because it's named after the book by Machiavelli, The Prince. And the way in which the Prince system would work, and here's an example of the Prince system. So this is a Prince analysis for a policy that will restrict the number of hospital beds in a community. So we're thinking about this new policy that will reduce the number of hospital beds in the community to try and save money. What you do in a Prince analysis is you first identify your stakeholders, your actors in the policy formulation process. So for a policy like this of reducing the number of hospital beds in the community, Some of your important stakeholders are the hospital administrators themselves, the community health board, hospital staff members, the physicians association, the media outlets, the mass media, and a citizens oversight committee. So here we've got 6 different primary stakeholders. And in this print system, we are going to assess the influence they may have on the passage of this policy, the formulation of this policy. So you first identify your stakeholders. Then for each one of those stakeholders, you identify what we call the issue position, which is how strongly they favor this policy versus how strongly they are opposed to the policy. So typically in a Prince analysis, we call this issue position, and we'll score it ordinarily from a -3 to a +3. So a -3 would be someone or a group that is really adamantly opposed to this policy. A +3 would be a group that is very much in favor of the policy. And then you've got your gradations in between with a 2 and a 1 and a 0 and a -1 and a -2. But we assess their position on this policy. Then secondly, we assess their power. So the amount of power they have, the amount of influence they have over this policy making process. This we score from a 1 to a 3. So those who have the most power score a 3, those who have the least power score a 1, and 2 is right in the middle. But the third thing we look at is salience. How important is this policy issue to this individual or to this group? Again, scored from 1 to 3. 3 would be a very important issue. They're really, really concerned about it. 1 would be relatively unimportant for that group or that stakeholder. So for each stakeholder, you look at issue position, power, and salience. You then multiply each one of those factors. And so for hospital administrators, they score a -2 on issue position, which means hospital administrators are pretty opposed to this reduction in hospital beds in the community. They score a 2 on power, which means they're kind of middle of the road in terms of the amount of power that they have. And they score a 3 on salience, in that this is a really, really important issue for these hospital administrators. So -2 times 2 is -4 times 3 gives you a total support of hospital administrators of -12. They're very much opposed to this policy. Community Health Board is the next stakeholder up. Issue position, they're right in the middle. They're kind of ambivalent, so they get a 0. They're not really for it, they're not against it, they're right in the middle. Power, though, they're very powerful, they get a 3. And salience, it's a middle of the road issue, so they get a 2. You ignore the 0 because obviously the 0 cancels everything out, but you would multiply the power times the salience, 3 times 2, which then gives you a total support score of 6 for the Community Health Board. Hospital staff, they score a -2 in terms of issue position. They're very much opposed to it, not as opposed as they possibly could be, but they are clearly one of the most opposed stakeholders out there. Very little power, though. They only get a 1 on power. They get a 3 on salience. Again, you multiply it out, -6 for them. Physician Association, -1, 1, and 2 gives you a total score of -2. Mass media, 2, 2, and 1 gives them a score of 4. Citizens Committee, 3, 1, and 2 gives them a score of 6. What you then do is once you calculate all the total support for each one of your stakeholders, in A, you would then add up all the scores of actors who are supporting the issue. But you would not include the Community Health Board because they have a issue position of 0. So they're not supporting or opposing it. So you'd only add up the ones that have positive scores in terms of their position support. You get a total score of 10 once you add those scores up, because you've got your mass media with a 4, you've got your Citizens Committee with a 6. So you've got a score of 10 for those supporting. You then take the absolute value of actors who are opposing the issue. Now, obviously, you want the absolute value because negative signs would cancel themselves out. So you just take the absolute value. We've got hospital administrators. They're a 12. They're very much opposed to it. Hospital staff, they're a 6. Again, very much opposed to it. Physicians Association is a 2. You add all that up, you have 20 as your value for actors opposing the issue. Then the Community Health Board, those are the ones who have not taken a position on the issue. They have a 0 there. Their total support score is a 6. You add up all those three numbers, you end up with 36. 36 is then your denominator in your calculation you're going to use to determine the likelihood of the passage of this policy. In your numerator, you take A, which is 10, and you add that to 1/2 of C. And C, again, will be your stakeholders who did not take a position. That score is 6. You take half of that, that's 3, added to 10, you have 13 as your numerator. So you would then take 13 and divide it by 36, and you end up with 36%. So with this Prince analysis, the likelihood of this policy being formulated to reduce the number of beds in the community is 36%. So it's less likely to be formulated than more likely. It's less likely to happen than a 50-50 type of chance. So chances are this policy is not going to make it to being a legitimate policy. It's not going to make it through that policy formulation process. We're probably going to be looking at another policy alternative to form the basis of the policy we need in order to save money in that community. You're not going to have to do this. You're not going to go through any of these calculations, but I just kind of want to give you an idea of there are some strategies we can use where we can actually put quantitative numbers on the support of different stakeholders to help us see the possibility or the probability of a policy coming to fruition. You really do need to have that politically feasible environment in order for a policy to come to fruition. This reduction of the number of hospital beds may make great economic sense, but clearly it doesn't have the political support to make it through the formulation process. So we've spent all this time up to now, and we're coming to the end of the discussion, so we can take a break in a minute, but all this point up to now in the class, we've been talking about comparing policy alternatives primarily in the formulation phase, in terms of looking at their benefits and their costs and the cost effectiveness and the political feasibility. But we also need to understand that a lot of policy happens in the implementation phase as well. And so when you're thinking about your alternatives, you want to think about political feasibility, you want to think about benefits and costs, you want to think about effectiveness and efficiency and ethics and all those evaluative criteria, but you also want to consider implementation. Because as we've said many times in this class, even a very well designed and formulated policy, if it is not implemented appropriately, is going to fail to achieve our desired outcomes. Now, in our civics classes in high school, we were always told that Congress formulates policies and then it's the executive branch's job to implement those policies. And once the executive branch gets those policies, they will implement it the way in which it's written by Congress. We all know that's not the case. We know that when policies are passed through Congress, they tend to be vague and they tend to be relatively ambiguous. And so a lot of decisions get made by these institutions, these organizations that are implementing these policies. So as you are comparing your alternatives, you'll need to think about ease of implementation. How easy or how difficult are these policy alternatives in terms of being implemented effectively on a daily basis? There's a very famous study back in the 1970s by two authors named Pressman and Wildofsky. And what they did is they looked at these programs that were being implemented under this policy from the Economic Development Agency in Oakland, California. And the Economic Development Agency, the ADA in Oakland, California, was implementing all these different approaches to try and revitalize the economy and to try and increase and enhance African-American employment in Oakland, California. So they had all these different things they were trying to do. There are four major things they were trying to do. Won't go into all of them, but they were creating transit to the Coliseum. They were trying to create better mass transit within Oakland, California. They had all these different things they were trying to do. Ostensibly, it was a well-designed policy. The problem that Pressman and Wildofsky found is it fell apart at the implementation phase on the ground in Oakland, California. And the reason why implementation fell apart is that the implementers, those officials working in Oakland, California, did not buy into the policy. They were not terribly supportive of the policy. And so what President Wildofsky found is that successful implementation is a function of the directionality of support on the part of the implementers and the intensity of their support or their opposition. In other words, we have to ask the question, do these implementers agree with or do they oppose this policy? Secondly, how intensively and what intensity do they have in their support or their opposition for the policy? So if you've got a lot of implementers who are very much opposed to this policy and their opposition is very intense, you're not going to get the policy implemented. There's going to be a lot of bargaining and negotiation that you have to do. And President Wildofsky found that there was so much intense opposition that all the actors did is they spent their time bargaining. They spent their time negotiating as opposed to actually implementing the policy. Policies are almost never self-implementing. You think about things like the ACA. ACA was designed, it was formulated, it legitimated through law, then it had to be implemented. And we saw what happened at the state level through implementation. We had some states that refused to participate in the creation of these health exchanges, and just literally refused to create health exchanges in their state. They said, we don't agree with this, and so we're not going to do it. Federal government, make us. When you got a situation like that, the policy is not going to implement itself. And so we had a lot of problems with states dragging their feet on the implementation of these health exchanges. So when you think about your policy options, think about the ease of implementation. Think about your implementers. Are your implementers likely to support or oppose this policy? Because the more they oppose it, the more intensely they oppose it, as President Wildofsky tells, the less likely it is to ever come to fruition and to achieve the goals and the objectives that we are trying to achieve. We also, when we think about comparing alternatives, we think about how easy are these policies to evaluate? Because once we implement the policies, we need to evaluate them. How else are we going to know if we are achieving the outcomes we want to achieve unless we actually evaluate these different policies and the programs within them? And when you think about a policy, you think about a policy as kind of being the umbrella. And then all of the things that hold that umbrella up, those are the individual programs. So in order to, when the rubber meets the road, and in order to actually implement this policy, we're probably going to be implementing individual programs. So we're going to need to evaluate those programs as well as evaluating the overarching policy. So think about how easy or difficult it is to evaluate the programs and the policy, because if you cannot properly evaluate, you're not going to be able to ever know the benefits and the outcomes that are being derived because of the implementation of that policy. So I know I've talked a lot, but I really want to give you a good overview of how we assess all these different policy proposals and alternatives, because again, in your second paper in 2 weeks, you're going to be presenting to me 2 or 3 alternatives, and then in your final paper, you're going to be comparing those alternatives to each other and then selecting which alternative is the most appropriate one to then become the basis of the policy to address your societal problem. So the purpose of tonight was just kind of to give you an overview of all the different criteria that you can use as you compare your different policy alternatives to each other in selecting your final alternative that will become the focus of that final paper you'll be doing for the course. And I know, I'm sorry, it's already 8:20. Got a little bit longer than I wanted to, but any general questions at this point on assessing alternatives, evaluative criteria, any of this information right now? I know it's a lot. I apologize for that, but I just want to make sure you got all this information and then also have the opportunity tonight to apply it in a group setting so that you'll feel more comfortable actually coming up with those 2 or 3 alternatives for your second paper in 2 weeks. So where we are now is we're ready for a break, probably well overdue for a break. But what I would like to do is let's take about a 10-minute break. If we come back at 8:30, well, we will come back, but when we come back at 8:30, I've got a breakout group exercise designed for us where we will give you an opportunity as a group to brainstorm and develop some alternatives for one societal problem from one member of your group. Then share out what that those two alternatives are, some of the costs and benefits associated with those alternatives, and just give you some practice working with your colleagues to think through some of these issues in terms of how are we going to develop these alternatives and then compare them to each other. So let's go ahead and take a break, come on back at 8:30, and then I'll break you up into groups and we'll do our breakout group exercise. Okay, it's 8:30, so we are back. Let's go ahead and do our breakout groups now. And again, what I have designed for this exercise, I'll break you up into 3 different groups. And as a group, what I want you to do is to briefly discuss your societal problems that you've chosen for your assignments. Then what I'd like for the group to do is to agree upon one of those problems that you've heard, one problem from one of your colleagues, and for that one problem to develop 2 possible alternative solutions to solve the problem that may serve as a basis for a policy approach. So 2 possible alternatives. In your discussion, consider costs and benefits associated with each of those 2 alternatives. Then what I would like for you to do, obviously, is to also select a spokesperson. We'll spend maybe about we'll say we'll spend 30 minutes on this. Then when we're done, then we'll have the spokesperson from each group. We'll share out and we'll see what we came up with. But just again, just an exercise to allow you to work collaboratively to kind of think through the brainstorming of how you come up with these alternatives to then help you with that second paper assignment. Okay, sound good? Yeah, let me go ahead and recreate the rooms so we can get closer to equal number. Okay, let me open up the rooms and then you can go into your room. And like I said, we'll reconvene about 9 o'clock and then we'll share out and see what you came up with. Okay, all right, let me open up the rooms and you will be off. Okay, rooms are open. Okay, we are back. Looks like everyone's back in the main room. So I don't want to keep you here all night tonight. So I think we do this rather expeditiously. Let's go ahead with room 1 and the spokesperson for room 1.
Yeah, so some of us kind of touched on each other's societal problems. One that we mentioned was food insecurity. And so 2 possible alternatives is a lot of with the government partnering with nonprofit organizations. So kind of similar with the idea of how they contract out to private entities. They can contract out their work to nonprofits. So one would be subsidizing meals through meal delivery services. So partnering with organizations like Meals on Wheels or Project Angel Food, where they could match donations. So that way these nonprofits can be more efficient and hit a larger demographic and serve more people. And then the other idea was urban farming. So bringing more locally accessible sources of fruits and vegetables to food insecure communities. So nonprofits could rent the land or plots from the city, cover staffing costs, or be volunteer based. And then possibly hold low-income farmers markets where they could utilize government CalFresh programs.
Very good. What I like about both of those alternatives is the inclusion of nonprofits, because by including nonprofits, if they're already a stakeholder, certain nonprofits are a stakeholder, but by including them actively in these partnerships, I think what you're doing is you're enhancing the stake they have in the issue, and making them more invested in the issue. And so I think that would certainly bode well from a President Waldowski perspective of getting support from implementers, you include them in the process, they're obviously going to be more supportive of the goals and objectives of the policy. So I think that's probably one of the strongest benefits that you probably would get from either of those two approaches. So, okay, very good. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Well done. Let's see at room number 2.
Hi, I was the speaker for group 2. So we ended up going with the childhood obesity problem, and then the 2 potential solutions or alternatives that we came up with was having nutrition and physical education requirements at schools for elementary through high school, and then also having laws or policies restricting what foods and drinks are sold at schools. For example, there is currently like a no soda ban at in California schools, and there's a ban on most sugary drinks, and there's only like certain drinks that are allowed to be sold at schools.
Good. And yeah, like you said, that we some of these things are in place, and expanding these, the nutrition and PE. I know just from my service on the school board, when I first joined the school board, we had a lot of issues with PE and some pushback from our teachers association in terms of needing to meet the PE minutes. And so the state of California, was pretty forceful about having a certain number of minutes that you had to cover in PE. At least it was the elementary level. I was in a TK through 6 district. You had certain number of minutes you had to meet. And so in order to be in compliance with the state law, we then had to request or require that our teachers constructed their PE logs, and they would turn in their PE logs to record those minutes to remain in compliance. A lot of teachers, didn't like that. They also didn't like the fact that it was taking away from planning time for other subjects. What my district actually ended up doing is allocating money for what we call TOSAs, teachers on special assignment, and created a couple of teacher on special assignment positions for PE specialists. And so those teachers who volunteered for those positions became the PE specialists, and they would put together lesson plans to share with teachers so that they could unburden them from all this additional time doing the PE lessons. And they also could then maintain the tracking of the minutes and the logs. And so our teachers didn't have to do that on a daily basis. And that's one way in which we were able to then expand the amount of PE being offered in our 15 schools. And so, it's a practical issue. It's one I've lived through. And I think that there are a lot of different nuances to that type of policy, but good. All right, very good. Thank you very much. Room number 3.
Is that Summer, Rudy, and
Yes, Summer, Rudy, and Sam.
So we all had 3 different problems, or 3 different, so I'll go with mine. I'm writing on paid family leave. And so, Rudy brought up that a lot of employers have the issue of paying for not only the salary of the person that's leaving, but also having to then find a replacement. And there's a lot of issues with contract workers. So trying to find solutions to that, which would probably be offering education on temporary workers or agencies that kind of work during the PFL, maybe offering a lower wage, while in that time. Another issue with the PFL is the public opinion on parents leaving. There's a lot of stigma for parents to go back to work. Other countries view the issue as a public health concern, bonding with a newborn, whereas Americans see it as more, okay, well, you have your baby and then you immediately go back to work in this, capitalistic society. So really changing the education and showing employers as well as just the American public that this bonding is crucial for the development of your baby and also the mental and physical health of parents, in reducing postpartum anxiety and depression for both mother and father. And it also helps decrease SIDS for the newborn, and it also helps their resilience and decreases mental health issues later on in life. So this newborn bonding is really critical for their lifelong development. And so I think just like changing the stigma around that, and then also with the, going back to like employers having all these issues and seeing these like, okay, well, what's in it for me? There are a lot of, I think there needs to be education on how other countries do it, because for them it's working. And so I think taking into consideration their policies can be helpful when creating policies here in the US, because I think very few first world countries don't offer. I think there's only 3 that don't offer paid family leave, and there's like 163 countries that do. So we definitely have to get on that.
Yeah, agreed. And I think you did a really nice job describing the idea of best practices. And we do that a lot when we're formulating policy, is we look at best practices of other governments and other organizations, and how those policies have worked in other settings, and we can take those policies and we could modify them and apply them. Those types of best practices, very common approach, and it's very timely as well. The topic, I'm sure if you've been watching the news, you've seen Secretary Buttigieg, and he took family leave, and some of the criticism he got for doing that, especially at the time in which he did it. One of the things I know the university did as a COVID type of measure that I think it will probably end up being expanded to maybe help cover family leaves, is the creation of a pool, from a staff perspective, creation of a pool of staff members, a rotating pool of staff members who could then go and cover in different departments as staff members, in the past would go on COVID leave, but now go on family leave, that they could then go in and cover those positions. And so, there's a myriad of different solutions that could be used for that. But I think you're right. We are relatively atypical compared to a lot of our European counterparts in this regard. So very good. Okay, thank you very much. One thing I would like to draw your attention to is we were talking about the creation of alternatives and the assessment and comparison of alternatives. Keep an eye on the what's going on with the VA and homeless vets. I don't know if you've been watching that on the news, but there's a homeless encampment for veterans outside the VA in Los Angeles. And the policy that the VA is now implementing is they're creating temporary housing units on the grounds of the VA, within the walls of the VA, and are then relocating veterans from this area outside the walls into these temporary facilities within the walls of the VA. It's an interesting policy option that they have selected. What you'll see is a lot of homeless advocates who criticize it and say, well, it's not a permanent solution, it's only a temporary solution, and advocate for other more permanent solutions. And so, moving these veterans onto the grounds of the VA in these temporary housing units, that's one solution to the problem. Another solution to the problem could have been something such as, renovating hotels and motels, taking abandoned motels, renovating those, and making those living units for those veterans who are currently homeless. That's another possible option. Another possible option would be construction of new facilities, new housing to house these veterans. And again, those are just 3 possible options. The VA has so far chosen the first one of temporary housing units. And so keep an eye on that and see if that continues to be the policy approach that the VA is pursuing, or if the VA changes course and listens to some more of the advocates and goes to a more permanent type of approach, such as renovation of motels or building creation of brand new facilities. But it's an ongoing policy experiment that's going on right under our noses here in Los Angeles for a very important societal problem, which is veterans who are homeless. And so keep an eye on that. And it's kind of like a laboratory for a lot of the things we talked about in class that you can see playing out in real life on a daily basis. I just want to mention that because I know that's going on, and I don't know if you've been paying attention to it, but again, it's a good laboratory to kind of take a look at and see some of these theories and some of these concepts we talked about in class actually at play in that type of situation. Yvette, go ahead.
Yes, just a quick question about that temporary housing. Do you know if that's like temporary in it just in the fact that they're going to work on getting them permanent housing, or is that just temporary housing and that's just how it's going to stay?
That's a great question. I don't think there's a final decision on that yet. I think it's a stopgap measure right now. But what it is they're essentially, they have temporary housing units, and they're creating a temporary community of temporary housing units on the grounds of the VA. And the idea is you can centralize services, and also these folks are a lot safer than being outside the walls. They're on the property of the VA, so they have built-in security there for them. They have fences around, so you don't have to worry about some of the crime that was going on, where there are a lot of assaults and there are a lot of robberies among these folks living outside the walls. Now they're in a much more secure environment. I think it's a good question as to how long this is going to persist. I think sometimes we develop these temporary policy solutions, and when they initially work, they sometimes end up becoming permanent. Now, I don't know how permanent this temporary housing can be, but as of right now, I think that is the approach. And then we'll see what the more permanent solution is in the future, whether it be renovation or construction of new affordable housing.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. It's a great question. And, it's an ongoing, evolving type of policy approach. So just, again, a really good living example for a lot of the things we talked about here in the class. Okay, well, thank you very much for hanging with us tonight. I know some colleagues took off, but I'm glad you hung with us and did the breakout groups, because I think it is useful to talk through some of these issues, and will help you then with your next paper coming up in 2 weeks. Again, remember, next week there is no class, but I am available via email if you have any questions at all about either Beach Board number 3 or your second paper assignment. Feel free to send me an email. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good remainder of your week. Have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you again in our next session on the 18th. Okay, take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Thank you.